Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this panel entitled Axis of Reaction, Putin and the Global Far Right. This is sponsored by the Ukraine Solidarity Network here in the United States, which has been campaigning in support of Ukraine's struggle for self-determination against Russian imperialist war that has occupied their country since 2014 and escalated with another invasion 2 years ago. And we're right on the heels of the anniversary of that invasion. My name is Ashley Smith. I'm part of the Ukraine Solidarity Network as well as the Tempest Collective. So we have a fantastic panel this evening that's going to address one of the key questions, I think, in the world, which is the rise of this new far right. And in particular, Putin's role in that, not only inside Russia, but globally as a kind of beacon of the far right. So as our description puts it, the Western establishment led by the Biden administration defends the unjust status quo with increasing repression, best exemplified by its support of Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. Against it, Putin's regime in Russia has positioned itself as part of a global far right, rallying support for its imperialist war in Ukraine, its autocratic rule in Russia, and its reactionary domestic social program. So we have, as I said, a wonderful panel this evening, and I'll introduce the speakers in order in which they'll speak with their initial comments. Our first speaker will be Ilya Budraitskis. He is a political theorist and activist from Russia, a visiting scholar with the program in critical theory at UC Berkeley, and author of Dissidents Among Dissidents, Ideology, Politics, and the Left in Post-Soviet Russia. He is a member of the editorial board of the Russian socialist website Postle, which I encourage everybody to read. It's got fantastic material. John Feffer will be our next speaker. He's Director of Foreign Policy in Focus, another fantastic publication at the Institute for Policy Studies, and is the author most recently of Right Around the World, the global networking of the far right and the left response. And finally, we'll have Blanca Missé, who is an associate professor of French at San Francisco State University, a member of the executive board of the San Francisco State University chapter of the California Faculty Association, a member of California Scholars for Academic Freedom, and a member of Workers' Voice. So after the speakers are done speaking, we'll have responses from the speakers to one another, as well as some questions that I'll pose to the speakers, and then we'll have questions from the audience. So as you listen to the speakers, we really encourage you to put your questions in the chat, and we'll pose as many of them as we possibly can in the question and answer session. And then I'll give some time at the very end for our three speakers to wrap up with final comments. So let's start with Ilya. Please begin, Ilya.
Thank you for this invitation, for this opportunity to speak about such important issues. So 2 years ago, when Putin started this war, as probably all of you know, he gave a long address which provides some reasons for the start of this war, and which provide the whole ideological explanation behind it. And according to this explanation, so it was not any sort of immediate military threat from the side of Ukraine or from the side even of NATO to Russia, but it was the threat from the very existence of Ukraine as the independent country, which continue to exist outside of the Moscow sphere of influence. So you can see how during these 2 years of this terrible war, this ideological ground for the war, how this ideological ground was expanded, like internationally and of course domestically. So even 2 weeks ago, when Putin gave his famous interview to Tucker Carlson, he started. Actually, it was very interesting interview because Carlson and all the Putin's fans in US, they expected to see Putin as a kind of rational leader who will talk about some pragmatic things about NATO and who will show that he is ready to make some deal. And that's why Carlson asked him, so what about NATO? NATO, if it was the main reason of the war? And Putin said, no, it was not. If you want to understand the real reason of this war, you need to listen my short lecture for 40 minutes about Russian history starting from 1,000 years ago. And it was, of course, it was the power move, because for Putin it was very important to show that he is stronger than Carlson, he is stronger than these American journalists who are probably paid by CIA. But also for him, it was important to stress the very nature, not just of this war, but of the, let's say, legitimation of his power, which is coming not from the people. It is coming not from the present, but it's coming from the past. It's coming from the history. It's coming from the tradition. It's coming from some eternal life of the Russian state and its interests over the hundreds of years, over the centuries. So what was the reason, the ideological reason, the ideological vision behind this war? What are the main features of this? So firstly, it's imperialism. Imperialism not only as the in the economic notion of imperialism, but imperialism as the political idea, as it was known from the late 19th century, is the idea that the very nature of the empire is to expand. So expansion is the life of the empire. It's the life of the imperial society. The war is not just a duty, but it's a sort of destiny. And this war is necessary not only to prolong the life of the empire, of the imperial state, but also to educate and disciplinize the society inside the empire. And you can see that from the very beginning of this war, this internal process of disciplinization, as Putin put it, purification. It's his term, and actually it was the term by Hitler in his times. So the main idea that the war is also a kind of cleaning process, for the nation, for the Russian nation of itself. So what does it mean? It means that all the elements which are unhealthy, all the elements which are not correspond to this main aim of the war as the historical destiny of the state, all these elements should be eliminated from the society. What are these elements? LGBT and transgender people. You know that even before the war, there were some restrictions, some homophobic laws. But after the start of the war, they came to another level. So now we have a total ban of all the LGBT, of all the public expression of this in the Russian society. So the belonging to the LGBT is like totally criminalized. Then, of course, any sort of political dissent, all the sort of the disagreement with the actions of the state, not only in the front line, but in any level of the social life. So for now, you can say that these repressions in Russia, they reach the level of Stalinist repressions of the Great Terror, but definitely they are much more massive than the repressions of the late Soviet times, for example, of Brezhnev times. So you can imagine that from last 2 years, about 20,000 people were arrested, detained, or fined because of their expression of their anti-war and anti-Putin views. Around 1,000 were arrested and jailed because of their political position. And it seems that after the coming presidential elections in Russia in the mid-March, this level of repressions will be even higher. So what are let's say the proposition of this imperialist and chauvinist far-right ideology for the world? What is the global, let's say, proposition? Is the idea that you have nothing like universal in human life, and basically you have no human as a human being. You have only representatives of various cultures, of various civilizations, which has their own way of thinking, their own consciousness, and you can't find anything collective, anything that belongs to the humanity as such. And this message, which is not just rhetorical, but also practical, there is a long story of support and collaboration of Kremlin with the far right around the globe. So this collaboration based on the common common program of the transformation of the societies and the various parts of the earth. So that's why I think we can't take Putinism as the sort of the Russian thing. We can't talk about Putin as just a product of some unique circumstances of the post-Soviet Russia, but we need to look at it as the part of the global phenomena, and also as the vanguard of this global phenomena, because some, let's say, main elements of the programs of political transformations of their countries by the far right, they already realized in Putin's Russia. So in some way you can see what is happening in Russia as a possible future for the...
Much for that, Ilya. John, you're up next. Go ahead.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you, Ilya. I'm just going to kind of explore some of the implications of what Ilya has said about kind of Putinism and Putin's. That has been a complicated relationship, and a relationship that has evolved. And I would say that for much of two levels of engagement. I mean, the first was, of course, trade, very practical. The far right ideology, or at least the connections between Putin and far right ideologies around the world. I'm going to focus on Europe because that has been kind of the center of I think, Putin's strategic vision, if you will. And of course, the relationship between Putin and Putin's administration, the Kremlin, and Europe has been complicated. I would say that prior to the 2022 invasion, the relationship kind of existed on two levels. I mean, at the vulgar materialistic level, it was trade. Russia obviously made a lot of money selling fossil fuels, predominantly natural gas, to European consumers in Germany and other countries. And the pipelines that delivered that natural gas, very important to kind of the Russian economy and economic growth. And then at this other level, the ideological level, well, Europe represented something rather negative, shall we say, for Putin. On the one hand, Europe and predominantly the European Union represented a bastion of liberalism, and obviously Putin very famously defined his system as illiberal. But at a more practical level, Europe was perceived as being behind color revolutions throughout the post-Soviet space, obviously in Ukraine, as well as the potential of spreading to Russia itself, if not directly funding or supporting these color revolutions, then at least serving as the inspiration, and particularly for Ukraine, where much of the country was interested in coming as close to Europe as possible through trade and even eventually for a lot of the citizens joining the European Union. So in order to kind of disrupt that, disrupt the color revolutions, disrupt that whole scenario, Putin was very interested in, of course, sowing dissent and sowing division within the European Union itself. And Putin spent a lot of time supporting Eurosceptics. In other words, political movements and individuals who either wanted to bring their countries out of the European Union, as we saw with Brexit and the Eurosceptical movement in the UK, or at least reducing the power of Brussels and asserting, the sovereign priorities of the countries themselves. But I want to focus on not just the specific relations that Putin's party established, United Russia, with, for instance, the Austrian far right or the Italian far right, prior to the current Brothers of Italy administration, but with Viktor Orban, because I think Viktor Orban, the leader, the prime minister of Hungary, is really the key central figure in kind of Putin's imagination or his plans, strategic plans for connection between Russia and the far right. And it might seem strange that Viktor Orban would emerge as this kind of second in command, if you will, in this imagined far right space or axis of illiberalism, because of course he began as kind of the paragon of liberalism, establishing the Young Liberal Party, Fidesz, denouncing Soviet troops in Hungary and calling for their withdrawal. And even, when this Russia, invaded Georgia, at that point, Orban too said, look, this is military aggression, this is unacceptable. But Orban saw a political opportunity on the right side of the spectrum in Hungary, and for opportunistic reasons kind of took Fidesz, a liberal party, and brought it over to the right. And he also saw political opportunity for Hungary, a small country, 10 million people, in challenging Brussels. Now, of course, Hungary is dependent on money coming from Brussels, and yet Orban thought, I am going to kind of assert Hungary as this sovereign nation that will not put up with the meddling of Brussels. And in order to kind of reinforce Hungary's position, he kind of established this strategy of reaching out to the East, reaching out especially to Russia and to Putin, and establishing a kind of strong bond with Putin. Now, part of this, of course, was ideological, and Ilya went over some of the ideological components of that. There's the religious component, there's the anti-LGBT, there's the illiberalism, the strong executive, without any kind of constraints imposed by the judiciary or the legislature. So there are a number of kind of key ideological elements that bring Orban and Putin together, and we can have an interesting discussion of how much of that is authentic and how much of that is purely utilitarian or purely opportunistic. But in terms of building the kind of far right axis, I think the two kind of key issues of overlap between the two are on the foreign policy dimension, and that is this notion of sovereignism. In other words, that a country should not have to put up with the meddling of either international authorities in the guise of the European Union or the United Nations, or even international law, that a country like Hungary or Russia should dictate their own laws, and that should be, obviously not democratically, that's not really their vision, but by the leader themselves. So that's one, sovereignism. And the second is a kind of anti-Western approach. That might sound strange coming from Hungary, which seems to be embedded in the West, but it's the West defined a certain way, defined as, decadent in some ways, defined as Anglo-Saxon. That's a word that Putin likes to use, which he used with the interview with Tucker Carlson. But so there's ideological affinity there. I want to focus in the last couple of minutes on what has changed in the last couple of years. And we've certainly seen a change with Hungary and Orban, where what had been a kind of strong Euroscepticism has now moved away from kind of rejecting Brussels to taking over Brussels. And this is kind of an extension of his earlier opportunism. Orban sees this great opportunity. There are far-right leaders that are coming to the fore, Wilders in the Netherlands, obviously Meloni in Italy, Fico in Slovakia, and the potential in the European Parliament elections for a majority, actually, of seats to be held by far-right parties. As well as a couple of elections coming up in Austria and Belgium that promise to bring in far-right leaders. And then an evolving strategy by Putin himself, whereas before he was obviously dealing at a mercantile level with Europe and with the West more generally. I think a decision to make an effective break with the collective West, as he puts it, or the Anglo-Saxon West, cutting trade ties, looking to China, looking to India, looking to the South and the East rather than the West. And that puts Orban in a difficult position, of course. The invasion did. He had to make a decision. Am I going to kind of support my colleagues in the European Union, or am I going to go all in with my friend in Moscow? And he's kind of tried to straddle it. I mean, he's basically, he has adopted Kremlin rhetoric on the war, not calling it a war, calling it a military operation, coming out strongly against sanctions. There might even be a irredentist motive in there. The far right, even further to the right party in Hungary, has said that if Ukraine falls apart, then Hungary is going to seize Transcarpathia, which is what used to be part of Hungary, about 150,000 Hungarians living in that part of Ukraine. So that might lurk somewhere in Orban's calculation, and yet still remaining within the European Union, trying to kind of change EU policy, thinking that he's going to have many more allies coming up after the European Parliament elections. There's a very interesting article by Szeleni, a Hungarian foreign policy scholar, at the end of which she says, we have to understand that Orban is not pro-Putin. He's not pro-Putin. I mean, it may seem like he's pro-Putin because he says some pro-Putin things, but ultimately Orban is pro-Orban. That's the only thing he cares about. He cares about ensuring the survival of his political administration and his own personal leadership in Hungary. I think you might say the same about Putin, and this would be my last remark, that you could say all sorts of things about what Putin believes in, but in the end, basically, he's pro-Putin. And so this kind of far-right axis of illiberalism, I mean, ultimately, I don't think it can go very far in terms of a strong axis, because the individuals who are participating in it are not really thinking in terms of solidarity across borders. I mean, they really are in it for themselves for the most part. And so I think there's a natural limit to this kind of far-right global organizing, and I'll end there.
Thanks so much, John. Blanca, you're next up, so take it away, Blanca.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you so much, Ilya and John, for your remarks. I want to start by building up a little bit on what Ilya said, that he spoke of Putin as the avant-garde of the far right. And I think the distinctive case of Russia under Putin is that we have a far-right government, right? So they're in power, and they're leading a war of invasion of an independent nation. They're claiming that this nation does not exist on its own, that it is a Western fabrication, and its goal is to either eliminate Ukrainians or assimilate them by force. This is not something new. It's been part of the imperialist rhetoric of Russia towards the Ukrainian nation and to appropriate its land and resources. And I think for us, it means that what the Putin regime is doing, it's showing us that the far right is not just about developing a cult or a nostalgia of a fascist past, or of a pure, glorious, homogeneous nation with racist ideals. It is about mobilizing in action the necessary political and ideological means to reenact imperialist and neocolonial projects of war and invasion. And by doing so, by boosting racial supremacist forms of nationalism and virtually erasing all the democratic freedoms working people and the oppressed have conquered. Something we're also seeing is that, and with Putin in particular, is that these efforts of war and imperialist aggression going hand in hand with boosting a propaganda machine, and the far right has been working very much in the world of ideas, not only to disseminate false information and claiming that real bombs and real crimes against humanity are quote-unquote fake news, but also there is a campaign to consciously undo what the global far right has called this liberal consensus or this liberal hegemony, right? And this idea that public discourse is articulated around two positions, liberals and conservative, but in fact they share a lot of common things. And so there is the goal to undo this hegemony and present a counter-hegemonic discourse. And this has been theorized, right, by far-right intellectuals, if we may call them this way, like Alain de Benoit in France or Alexander Dugin in Russia, right? They have been thinking about the ideological means that go with the wars and the occupations and the murders. But, you know, I think if we need to interrogate ourselves what Putin means for the global far right and the situation of the global far right today, after the Russian invasion, we also need to realize that Putin is not the only far right force that has been able to mobilize state apparatus to put forward racist and colonial wars of domination and probably genocides of entire populations, because the twin contemporary project of neo-colonial imperialist war today is what's happening in Palestine. With Netanyahu being in power, his government is a conservative government that is a fragile coalition with many far-right fascist forces in power, and he's leading a racist and apartheid settler colonial state. And if we then try to recapture Putin, the far right, and if we put Israel and Netanyahu and what's happening in the same picture, then we are forced to move beyond the simple binary narrative of there is the forces of good, that are democracy, and there's the forces of evil, that are like authoritarian states. And we need to think together, and I'm not saying I have a solution, but we need to think through major contradictions of our present time. The first one starts in our own country, and because I live and work in the United States, I cannot but not reflect on the contradictions of the so-called force of good and democracy, which is the Biden administration, which has embraced the fight for Ukraine against Russia as a fight for democracy and against totalitarianism. And then the question of the Biden administration is that it can fight for democracy in Ukraine while at the same time it finances Israel and the war of genocide in Palestine. And it's not only that one might start developing the contradictions of these two analogies, but the way through which Biden has been able to finance Israel's war has been precisely by violating the same principles of democracy he comes to defend, because he has not been able to approve the war credits for Israel in Congress. He has bypassed Congress twice in December to send $250 million of aid to Israel. So he has bypassed the democratic institutions and used executive orders and his power as president, while at the same time he claims to defend a democratic system of governance with elected representatives, right? A parliamentarian democracy. And now there is even a deeper paradox, because still in its crusade to defend democracy in Ukraine against Putin, and the difficulty he's having to rally the US nation because of the presence of the Republican Party and far-right forces in the Republican Party, which we know, right? The way he's trying to gather support to pass a bipartisan agreement is by agreeing with the Republican most conservative elements to have a so-called border plan of $20 billion. So in order to send the money to Ukraine for democracy, we're also spending, or the proposal by Biden is to spend $20 billion to reinforce the border, which means concretely to put more border patrol agents in the border, to restrict the conditions of asylum, to increase the deportations, and to send $14 billion to Israel. And this is just an example that complicates this. And I want to briefly talk about two other examples, because it's not just about confusion that exists in the United States. We think globally the far right is aligned with Putin. And John explained that this is the case of most of far right forces in Europe, for example. Like they're taking distances, but there is an example that goes against this rule today. If we think of far right governments, we think maybe of Javier Milei, who was elected in Argentina. Javier Milei is maybe today the most eccentric and radical far-right president in power, but he's not allied with Putin. Quite the opposite. He has pivoted away from Putin. He has embraced the US foreign policy. He's proposing to dollarize the economy, and he recently visited Israel and fully embraced the Zionist project, right? And he is one of the most far-right figures today in Latin America. We can also talk about the Saudi regime, which is the regime led by Mohammed bin Salman is far from being a democracy. It's been a dictatorial regime, a stable ally of the United States for decades, was even close to sign the Abraham Accords to normalize the relation with Israel, and now is pivoting away to other non-democratic regimes like China and Russia, right? He signed this agreement with Iran under the auspices of China last year. And last December, he hosted Putin in the middle of the war because they wanted to work together the price of oil through the OPEC Plus cartel. So I'm bringing these examples because I think that when we're trying to think through together this global far-right phenomenon, we need to see its totality, its commonality, and its contradictions. And I think the premise for us to go to the root of the cause of this issue is to move beyond these stale binaries of fascism versus democracy, of an axis of evil versus an axis of good, and then ask ourselves, what are the historical and social sources of these projects of reaction? Why we see today a growth of far-right forces that either embrace an imperialist project of their own or used and instrumentalized by major economic forces to carry out other projects of imperialist expansion and simultaneously attacking the social rights of working people. And I think when we do that, then we need to start looking what would be the reasons why we are seeing this phenomenon emerge. And I just want to propose 4 things that I think would be important for our analysis. The first, I think, is that this global rise of the far right comes at a moment where the crisis of capitalism are accelerating. There is a sense that the last 40 years of neoliberalism has failed to deliver many social goods and rights that were promised. What we're seeing everywhere is the implementation of a continuum of austerity policies in all countries, right? And this economic model has led to an erosion of a model of political governance, where parties will get to power one after the other, but it seemed that they were carrying forward a very similar economic policy. And the result of this attachment to a core of austerity policies and neoliberalism, we're never having in history a left or a social democratic government that is able to fully undo what the previous did, right? Is building or slowing down the loss of social rights. That has eroded the meaning of democracy for the mass majority of working people, women, LGBT communities, and youth. And so there is a disaffection of the popular classes with the so-called democratic regime that now Biden and other governments want to put forward. I think the third factor we need to discuss is the impending ecological catastrophe. Because not only the established governments have no solution, the far-right forces don't even acknowledge that this is an issue. But the absence of a solution for this has a deep impact in the population. It has an impact of social anxiety and catastrophism, of apocalypses, or in order not to deal with the anxiety of conspiracy theories, of like, this does not exist, this is not happening. So our failure to deal with the ecological and climate question is fueling the growth of far-right ideologies. And the last I want to say, of course, is the rise of inter-imperialist rivalry and the competition between empires. We're not anymore in a world where the US is ruling and everybody is quiet and the US is telling the rest of the countries what to do. The very reason why Putin invaded Ukraine is because he's trying to expand his empire and contest the hegemony of the US. And that's the very reason Biden is desperate to stop Putin and trying to, by any means, even if it means like sacrificing the immigrant workers, the immigrant populations, and human rights, by any means, because of this inter-imperialist competition, stop Putin. And that's the same reason why, even if Israel is committing in front of our eyes one of the worst genocides in history, the US is not willing to cut the aid, because the Israeli state is the medium through which the US still has influence in the region. And it needs to stay there to compete and dispute its hegemony with rising powers such as such as China and Russia in the region. So I would just end by saying, because we're now going to have a discussion, that if we really want to build an alternative to the far right, we need to build an alternative that responds to these root causes, these social causes. And we need to do it in a way where we don't resort back again to the support or the reformulation of these old establishment party solutions. And the only way is to connect the issues that connect them is the capitalist system. These are necessary features of capitalism, and we need to organize solidarity movements from below. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion, because I think the present situation today is puzzling, but working through these contradictions, I think we can go together to the root of the problem.
Thank you so much, Blanca. All those presentations were fantastic and touched on, so many different aspects of the problem with both the liberal capitalist establishment and also the threat and alternative posed by the far right, which postures so often as an anti-systemic challenge to the problems of people are encountering in our society. I first want to just encourage everybody to write their questions in the chat, and we'll get to them now that we've opened the question and answer session. I do have some questions that I want to pose to hierarchies of religion, hierarchies of traditional culture, of sexuality, gender, etc. Those seem to be really core elements, and I'd like you to flesh that out a little bit. Like, why the turn to those kinds of hierarchies? What is their function ideologically? Because it seems like a real commonality across the world with these different far-right movements and far-right governments. Everything from Modi to Putin to Malay. There's all these kind of features that are held in common. At the same time, the thing that Blanca and John were touching on is the schisms between these different far-right governments and far-right movements. That is, their nationalist divisions, so that we don't really see a far-right international taking shape, but a kind of family resemblance that includes contradictions and schisms. So I just would like you more to comment on the kind of what's the ideological core around reasserting these hierarchies, and what are the schisms that keep the right, especially when government, from forming some kind of far-right international. So I don't know, Ilya, would you like to start?
Yes, thank you. It's rather important question, and I think you are quite right about this idea of hierarchy, which is very important, and there is a definite idea to re-establish the social hierarchies and also the hierarchies in between the states. And I think that it's very important that John mentioned in his talk about this idea of sovereignty. So sovereignty is really it's a core concept for Putin, and sovereignty means in the Putin's political vocabulary, it means let's say undividable power, which is concentrated inside and outside the country. So that's why the true sovereign should deal with all the other sovereigns and not be restrained by any international rules. So that's why for Putin is okay to have some leaders in other countries who are unfriendly to Russia or who are basing on some historical, let's say, anti-Russian sentiment. For him, the most important thing that they are the true sovereigns of their countries, that they are not dependent on, let's say, international law, that they are not dependent on United Nations, because all these institutions, they're fake. They are part of this liberal, let's say, globalism, and they should be eliminated. So in this way, it's very interesting what Blanca just told about Milei. Because if you look at Russian propaganda, and I do it daily, so you can't find anything negative about Milei or about Bolsonaro, for example, who also was not a great, pro-Russian politician, because for Putin they mostly represent this kind of directions towards the sovereignty, which mean the elimination of any subordination with the international norms or whatever. And also there he sees that all these leaders they are following the same trend, the trend for, let's say, traditional values, the trend for some sort of authoritarian power, because authoritarian power is also something necessary for the true sovereignty, because you can't divide the power and weaken your sovereignty with the various democratic institutions. So that's why I think that this is the part of this global project, which not necessarily look like a political or military alliance. So it's not about the alliances. It's about how to reform, revise the international system. Yeah, and that's why, and probably that's the last thing. It's about the attitude of Putin to Israel and Palestine. Because the official Russian position is that Russia support the two states solution and criticize the Israeli occupation in Gaza. But the main criticism, if you look at the propaganda, it came not against Netanyahu, but against the Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxons are the most responsible for all that is happening in Gaza, because, as Russian propaganda is explaining, because they provoke the conflict in between Israeli government and the Palestinians. Because Netanyahu is a good person. He's a true sovereign. He's following the true interests, national interest of his country. There is no question for him. But there are all these questions that could be addressed to the, let's say, global elites who are trying to manage this crisis. And that is in the very core in all the, let's say, attitudes of Putin's Russia to the international problems.
Thanks, Ilya. John, do you want to respond?
Sure. I mean, the notion of global elites and the anger toward global elites, I think, is essential to understanding this desire to reassert hierarchies. And I really appreciated Blanca's four kind of root causes for the rise of the far right. I would tweak the first one because I mean, there is a crisis of capitalism, but I would say that to understand the rise of the right, I would reformulate that as a crisis of globalization. Now, you can say it's the same thing, but globalization, for better or for worse, destroyed a lot, or was in the process of destroying a lot of hierarchies. Now, we know it didn't create a flat world, as Thomas Friedman asserted. It created other concentrations of wealth and power, but it certainly challenged certain traditional hierarchies. Spread of knowledge, spread of people across, so it's not just the spread of capital. So it helps us understand why, in the same breath, a far-right politician could criticize immigrants and billionaires at the same time. Globalists who are in control of the international financial structures and the people who are being screwed over the most by these same structures. You would think, how could that be possible? But it's because of this critique of globalization and that has, I think, united far-right actors around the world. And then in terms of the inability of the far-right to get together, well, I mean, Steve Bannon, he put a lot of effort into this. I mean, traveling around Europe, going down and meeting with Bolsonaro and his family, meeting with Netanyahu, all trying to kind of get the far right on board, and with Donald Trump as this kind of symbolic leader. Now, Donald Trump could care less. I mean, that was the problem. Donald Trump is not interested in leading some international thing. I mean, he liked traveling places. He liked being, flattered and so on, but he was not interested in some kind of nationalist international. And soon Bannon realized that even neighboring countries in Europe were not interested in aligning themselves with each other. For instance, the Law and Justice Party in Poland and Fidesz in Hungary famously could not get along with each other on a number of key foreign policy and some domestic issues. And so whenever the European far right got together, it couldn't agree. And so that's why we have two major party blocks, and Fidesz has refused to, to align itself with either one of them. So we have, yes, it's true that there are, I think, there's the sovereignist approach that I think makes it difficult for countries to really see useful connections or even ideological connections that go beyond rhetorical ones. And it's true too that there's other ideological overlaps between these parties, but ultimately I think that it's going to be difficult for such an access to emerge in a practical sense. That doesn't mean that I am I'm optimistic the far right will collapse. In fact, I think the far right is on the march in their own particular countries around the world. Unfortunately, it's just I don't see that there's necessarily a lot of cooperation. Now, the point Ilya made about the kind of transformation of international affairs, well, they may not agree enough to kind of create something new, but they could agree enough to destroy what we already have. And I think that's the major challenge.
Thanks, John. Blanca.
Yeah, just briefly, I don't know if we can say they're core politics of the far right. I think they're core themes, right? Or this question of hierarchy. But for example, I think one of the differences that exist between even when we talk about sovereignism, right? You have far right groups that are about retreating and concentrating on the national sphere, right? And then you have far right groups that are about expanding to an empire. And usually our 1930s understanding of the far right is one of conquest, right? Mobilizing. But because today we have imperialisms that are in retreat, like the US imperialism or the French imperialism, you have suddenly the Heritage Foundation, which used to be about taking over and expanding out abroad now is saying, why are we financing these wars? Why are we spending money these? Why we don't concentrate and retreat? And it's the same thing that Marine Le Pen's party is saying in France. It's about so there is not even an agreement on the political economy. They're adjusting their political economy to, in many ways, they're anticipating the role their country is going to have in the new division of labor. And there's another difference between them, which is how to get to power. I mean, if one studies I'm not an expert of the far right, but there's traditionally two ways. One is the so-called conservative revolution, which is appealing to the people, this populist upheaval. And then there's the electoral route, right? And I know, for example, in France, right, the Marine Le Pen's party was for many years being more of the let's do an uprising, let's be the out of the system, we'll criticize the system from the outside. And now that they're trying to get elective, they need to become more compatible with institutions. And for example, this is what's pushing Le Pen to distance herself from other far-right projects, like the one in Germany, like Putin, right? Like it's saying, because they want to get to power, and they understand that this fantasy of a conservative revolution or a populist revolution from the right, they're not really willing to do that, lead a revolutionary process. And so they're changing also their alliances with other groups that are still playing with this outsider of democracy narrative. So this lack of a common strategy to get to state power or even reinvent state power is also one of the reasons why I think they're having difficulties blending together.
Thank you so much, Blanca, and to John and to Ilya for those comments. I think they're really all very insightful. One thing that comes out as a theme is, in different ways you touched on, the kind of failure of the capitalist establishment to solve the different crises in our society, whether you root it directly in capitalism or, as John talked about it, the impact of globalization, which obviously was a capitalist strategy coming out of the crisis in the 1970s. So all the kind of failure of that neoliberal project in the eyes of most people has given a big opening for the right to make a play politically, ideologically, and for governmental power in electoral situations, and then, seizures of power in non-democratic, non-electoral politics in different countries. So the question I have is, what is the social base that this right has found? What kinds of classes, fractions of classes, social groups? Who is it that the right has found traction in? When you think of what Trump has done, who's the base of Trump? Who's the base of Millet? Who's the base of Le Pen? Who's the base of Putin in different fashions? So I don't know. I named Trump, so maybe John will begin with you.
Well, you mentioned Trump, but I would begin with Poland in order to understand the social base, because, I've argued that essentially what happened in the 1990s in Poland and throughout Eastern Europe was a response to kind of hyper-liberalization, hyper-globalization, if you will, bringing countries like Poland and Hungary rapidly into the capitalist world. And the folks who were left behind in that process rebelled. They said, this didn't benefit us. I mean, yeah, you can get a great meal in Warsaw, you can own big buildings in Budapest, but we, what they call in Poland, Poland B, Poland A, benefited from all of the changes after 1989, 1990. Poland B did not. And who was Poland B? Well, it cut across what were the traditional class and party political divides in Poland leading up to that point. You had people who were in the countryside for the most part. Those might have been farmers. They might have been people working in industries in the countryside, or just people living in small towns. They were people who could not adjust to the transformations. They didn't have the skills. They couldn't speak English well enough. They couldn't use computers. There were people who aged out. In other words, they were pensioners. They were no longer part of this transformation that was taking place. There were other groups and forces in society that felt as if they were left behind, even if in fact they weren't left behind. I mean, there were plenty of people who benefited in Poland who still voted for the far right, voted for law and justice. But law and justice, I think, took advantage of this. You look at the election results in Hungary, who supported Fidesz. I mean, you'd have these little pockets in Budapest and a couple other big cities that still support liberals or communists or whomever, but the rest of Hungary, the countryside was Fidesz, firmly Fidesz. If you look in the United States for Trump, who supports Trump? Well, we know that it's the big cities, even big cities in red states, continue to support the Democrats, continue to go blue. And it's, because of the way our electoral system is skewed in favor of largely rural states that have disproportionate impact in the Electoral College, that someone like Trump could even get close to winning an election. He shouldn't even be close to winning an election. And yet it's because of the resentments of people. And many of those resentments, absolutely legitimate grievances about being left behind by the transformations of the American economy. So, people who have lost their manufacturing jobs, people who have, seen their family farms collapse in the last decade, all because of concentration of in the capitalist agricultural sphere. So I would say that there's an America A and an America B too, that it's different, of course, from Poland, it's different from Hungary, but I think you can find some version of that social base that supports the far right in many countries. Obviously a little different in a place like India, where you have a different kind of social composition of the electorate, but I think that's a good place to start, at least.
Great, thanks, John. Ilya, what's the social base of Putin?
I think that the very term social base is a bit of could be a bit of misleading, because it's quite clear that all various types of far right, they exploit some social anger, they exploit the atmosphere of let's say distrust to the major institutions of the state. They feed from the crisis of the previous forms of hegemony. Yes, so people don't believe in democratic institutions anymore. They don't trust the media, and they don't feel that they can benefit from the existent let's say economical system. That's the base let's say for all the far right. But the other question is how these elements of social anger, how this crisis of the bourgeois hegemony used by and instrumentalized by far right and not by far left, for example. And here we see this strategy of explanation or conceptualization of this conflict, the conflict in between the people and the elites in the cultural terms. So, for example, Putin also used the word neoliberal in a negative sense. But what is neoliberalism for him? Neoliberalism is gay marriage, is neoliberalism. So it's transgenderism. The all gender restrooms is neoliberalism. So and it's very interesting because in some way Russia even now is still a pretty much neoliberal state in the terms of governance and the terms of the very rationality of the state bureaucracy. Yeah, because this principle that everything should be profitable, that even the public institutions should be profitable, and so on, they're still there. But this is not neoliberalism. That is fine. The real neoliberalism is not real neoliberal. It is not neoliberalism, but the neoliberalism is something that defined in the cultural in the cultural terms, and I think that this cultural turn in all these explanations is the main let's say element of success of the far right internationally, and in this way you can see how the various far right, from let's say Putin to Trump, how they use the same let's say technologies, like ideological, let's say, techniques. So for instance, the concept of the culture war, which was established by American conservatives and which was very much used by Putin in order to marginalize the opposition inside the country, and the concept of the silent majority. So there is some kind of majority of hardworking Christian white people who has no other voice than the leader. Trump or Putin or whatever. So this concept also became a kind of internationally used technique of the various types of the far right. So here we definitely has the strategy of the counter-hegemony, as Blanca pointed out, which was developed by the French right or Russian right, because the Benoit and Dugin, they're friends for decades, and that raises the question for the left, the question of the counter-hegemonical kind of idea, counter-hegemonical strategy for the left, which could reformulate and explain this growing conflict between the people and the current forms of the governance of capital and so on in the different way.
Great, thank you, Ilya. Blanca, anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I generally agree with everything John and Ilya said. I think there's a question we need to ask ourselves on the question of social base, what is the position of the major economic powers in relation to the far right today? And we know, I say this because we know retrospectively in the case of Germany, the major corporate groups ended up backing the Nazi regime, right? And so I think we ought to ask this question. And I think, the early backers of like someone like Trump or Millet or even Le Pen are, I think, and John put it that way, are the capitalists who cannot adapt, are usually those who are not, who know they're failing and they're just trying to jump on this, right? But something happens very quickly. That is that when the major capitalist powers realize that they're going to lose the election, that the far right candidate is going to win, they pivot and finance them because they'd rather control them in office, right? In the case of Argentina, that was very clear when the major industrial group in the country, Techint, which is a multinational corporation that builds roads, bridges, all kinds of major infrastructure in Latin America, supported Milei at the last hour because, and that's happening right now in the United States, right? If you read the Wall Street Journal, you see that the major banks, JP Morgan, Citibank, they're all desperate. They don't want Trump. They're putting money in Nikki Haley, but in the end, they will pivot and finance him because they want to have some leverage on him when he's in office. And the last thing, which I think is a question for our times, it seems to me that there is a major sector of industry that is going to go out of business soon, or at least we want to put it out of business, which is the fossil fuel industry. And I have a sense that there is an incipient fascist possibility that these major corporations, if they don't manage to pivot and become the champions of the environment, as they're trying to do, and renew themselves, their own infrastructure and production apparatus I think they are potentially fascist financiers because they don't want the new green technological road. They don't want to go out of business. And so this is something we need to study together to figure out who is financing, at the end of the day, these candidates.
Thank you for that very disturbing note, Blanca, that fossil capital can produce fossil fascism, in our epoch. I have a couple of themes of questions that have come in. And first, I want to just ask a question about what this means. And Ilya raised it explicitly about the challenging situation that the left finds itself in, caught between a kind of neoliberal or liberal establishment, capitalist establishment, and the far right. And for lots of people don't like in the U.S. election, the choice between genocide Joe Biden and a wannabe dictator in the form of Trump. And a lot of people will, swallow their principles and vote for Biden to stop Trump for completely understandable reasons. But that strategy is not working. Obviously, it's not working because the far right, I think, both Ilya, all three of you have said, continues to rise in this moment because the mainstream capitalist parties don't have an answer to the deep crises in people's lives. So what should the left do in this kind of situation, faced with this devil's choice and a strategy that historically has turned to liberals to stop the right? What's the alternative to that, short term and long term? Maybe I'll reverse the order. I'll start with Blanca.
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, I think if we need to go to the root of the problem, we need to present an alternative that is really an alternative. Otherwise, if in the end you still support a remedial solution and the far right is going to keep growing. We're seeing it everywhere. Like if you look at 2016, the situation where we were, 2020, 2024, I mean, that's a phenomenon because there is no real political alternative. So I think to maintain a real independence from the establishment parties and refuse to give them any political support is a precondition. But then people are going to say, but then what, right? and I think that goes hand in hand with the need to organize a broad fight back with united front, a remobilization of the popular movements, of the unions, of the youth, to really fight for the things we need and we want to see. I mean, in the question of the environment, it's crucial to see like mass demonstrations for climate justice, to involve the unions in doing that, to organize with indigenous communities. And I say this because the youth is fighting for climate. The indigenous youth, the Black youth, the immigrant youth is fighting for climate. To put forward a program that argues for the end of the war, for full immigrant rights, like I think if we're able to articulate that from below with an independent perspective, all the emphasis will not be put on the elections. And I don't want to say the elections are not important. I think ideally we should be able to run independent candidates. In some countries, it's possible. In other countries, as the United States, the system is designed so it's virtually impossible to run independent candidates. But I think more importantly, that the electoral expression one might find, first, you need to build the real political alternative on the ground. And that means mobilizing working people, youth, and communities to put forward an alternative and respond to the causes that fuel the far right. And I think some of us were doing this in the US, and it's going to happen more and more as mobilizations increase in response to these issues.
John, let's go to you. And I'm thinking in particular about what we just witnessed in Michigan of this massive vote of the uncommitted, which is a significant political development of people trying to challenge the devil's choice that we're stuck in. So maybe what are your thoughts about the strategic question of the left?
Well, I read what happened in Michigan not as a kind of an uprising against the two parties. I mean, I really see it as an effort to get Biden to change his policy on Gaza. I mean, it's very specific. It's very short term. It may turn into something larger. That would be fabulous. But we'll see about that. I think we are dealing with a situation in which basically the far right has gone after the left's traditional constituency. It has mobilized a lot of folks who otherwise would be voting for the left or even did vote for the left. I mean, folks who supported Bernie or who supported communist parties throughout Europe switched over and they said, look, the left is no longer representing us, in part because the left has kind of joined hands with liberal forces in support of economic policies that don't benefit us. So if we want to grab back those constituencies, we have to have some form of economic populism, not political populism, not racial populism, but economic populism. That certainly has worked in the United States, and it works and has worked in certain places in Europe. But climate, I think, is the issue that that economic populism has to be wrapped in, if you will. And I agree that with Blanca that the climate is basically the issue that we, the left, progressives, have an advantage over the right on, because the right either is denialist or has taken essentially eco-fascist positions. And we have to also recognize that the far right has evolved in its policies on climate. So for instance, in Germany today, the Alternative for Deutschland has practically doubled its share of the vote by campaigning on one issue more than any other, and that is heat pumps. Not immigration, not heat pumps, arguing that heat pumps are too expensive. In other words, the underlying message is that you environmentalists and you green people, you basically are just supporting an elitist project that only benefits the upper middle class. So the real people in our country, the real people need coal, they need oil, they need natural gas. That's what real people need. Like they need to eat real meat or something like that, some strange argument along those lines. But it's throughout Europe that has been very effective, and it has been effective here in the United States as well. Kind of portraying the Inflation Reduction Act and other the tax refund for electric cars all as just an elite project. If we're going to be successful on the left, we have to have an economic populism that is green, green, and does not allow the right to portray us as an elite that is out of touch with the realities of ordinary people.
Thanks, John. Ilya, what's your take on these questions about left strategy?
Yeah, but it's interesting because now the Russian left, they're discussing their strategy in the situation of underground. So how to act in the conditions where any public activities is not possible anymore. And I think that could be another interesting topic to reflect for the left in the other countries, because the situation where you are still able to enjoy the freedom of assembly, or you're still able to participate in any elections is not something that could exist forever, actually. And in Russia or in some other, let's say, authoritarian, right-wing authoritarian countries, you see that the basic democratic institutions, the basic democratic liberties, they're already kind of eliminated. And I think that we have, especially among the US left or Western European left, some kind of nihilism about democracy, like in general. The idea that, well, you have capitalism, neoliberal capitalism everywhere, and its political forms like democracy or authoritarian dictatorship is not matter and all so much. And that, of course, can lead to some practical alliances with the far right that you have actually among the US, some part of US left as well. So now, for example, you see the US left who are distributing the same conspiracy theories, the same fake news as the far right, or actually distributing the fake news that are produced by far right. Yeah, so you have already this sort of alliance, which based on this kind of nihilism towards the democracy, that all the democratic institutions, they're basically is just a form of dictatorship. So that's why they're not meaning so much. So that's why I think it's very important to stress in this kind of social green populist program that John just proposed, that democracy for the oppressed classes is not the institutions that created from above. That is not the institutions that are created in order to keep the rule over the society. That's the feel of the struggle. And if the oppressed classes are not struggling for the basic democratic rights, then the ruling elites can easily eliminate these rights. So that's why I think it's so important to reflect it among U.S. left, especially with all the current examples of the restrictions of the free speech in the universities after the start of war in Palestine and so on. So you already have the exact examples how it would happen. And my main kind of lesson from the recent Russian history could be that it could happen not in one moment. It could be prolonged through years and years, and little by little your basic civil democratic liberties will be reduced, and one day you will find yourself in the fascist type of dictatorship.
Great. One final question, and then we'll have time for you guys to do a little wrap up, and I'll bring it to a close at the end. It's something that Blanca flagged earlier in her talk is about the changing character of the global state order. That it's no longer the situation where the U.S. is just an unrivaled superpower and everybody else is just obedient or subject or bullied into accepting the U.S. dictates. It's a vastly different situation where you have, as Gilbert Ashkar has called it, a strategic triad of really three central imperial powers that are at loggerheads. That of the U.S. obviously is still the top dog, but also significantly China as a potential imperial rival of the U.S. and Russia, which is a kind of an outsized imperial player because of its nuclear power and fossil fuel industry. And so you've got this, but there are other players as well as at a global scale and a regional scale, states that are bucking U.S. dictates and asserting their own direction. And that's posed a question which I think the left has been unable to manage, and it raises the question of principles, which Ilya was just raising around the question of commitment to democracy, which is a commitment to the right of oppressed nations to self-determination, which I think has been violated as a principle by whole sections of the left, not just around the question of Ukraine, around the question of Hong Kong, around the question of any number of countries that have been the butt end of lesser imperial and regional powers, and there's been an absence of a kind of universalist approach. But I want to narrow that question down to the question of two related questions: one a narrow one and one a big one. The narrow one: why has whole sections of the left given alibis to Putin's war, or supported it in the worst cases, or taken an agnostic position on the question of Ukraine's right to self-determination? And what should the left do in this kind of situation? And a related question: what's the alternative to the politics which seems so predominant on the left of my enemy's enemy is my friend? That is, that because I hate U.S. imperialism so much, I'll be sympathetic or give a pass to other imperial powers and betray the nations that they oppress. So maybe we can begin with Blanca.
Well, I mean, this question of why the left is at the state it is a vast question, Ashley. But some things come to mind. First, I think that the sectors of the left who have failed to have a motion of solidarity with Ukraine or with other countries like that, I think first one must assume that their forces of the left are very isolated from the global working class movement, right? Because the Russian state has a track record of imperialist aggression in the region, right? To Georgia, to Chechnya, to the invasion of Crimea in 2014. And so if one were to imagine a left organization that is international, that has connections with the left in Russia, in Ukraine, one could not for a second take this position, right? So there is, I think it helps us read symptomatically which projects of the left have confined themselves to national borders and implicitly adopted the national bias of judging everything through the lens of their own either bourgeois national governments or imperialist governments, and then judging reality just from the standpoint of that because they lack a crucial connection to the working class and popular movements all over the world. So I think that is already one of the big, and we see that those who have an internationalist project of building an international left have a different reaction and different instinct to when popular movements against dictatorships or against wars emerge. But I think there is a second reason, and then why this left that is so isolated and its base is shrinking, how is it continue to exist, right? Because one would imagine that a left that grows so isolated and confined to national borders fails, like at some point either ceases to be a left or disappears. And I think it has to do with the history of the left that is always a product of contradictory process of struggles and revolutions and changes. And there has been in our history forms of the left or splits of the left that have characterized themselves from harnessing the continuation of revolutionary processes by becoming sometimes challenged by the full development of democracy from below and people's agency from below, that have also tried to confine revolutionary transformations within national boundaries, and even sometimes that have tried to slow them down to maybe make what at the time were temporary alliances with bourgeois or capitalist forces, which became themselves, right, they transformed the nature of the left and they became the new bourgeois government. So if one thinks of Ortega's government in Nicaragua, which is the so-called product of the Sandinista revolution, but it is also the reversal of the impulse of the Sandinista revolution, of the Maduro regime today in Venezuela, which is the product and also the counter-revolution of the great revolutionary upsurge of El Caracazo in the 90s of Venezuela. I could go for many countries, this idea that how left are these forces, which have institutionalized themselves, sometimes by saying this is just a temporary compromise, this is just a temporary slowdown, this is a temporary emergency repression, but they have completely killed, substituting themselves and become the main agents of repression. And because, and I finish with this, because they have ended up becoming new forces of exploitation and oppression, let's put it bluntly, they have the economic resources to reproduce themselves that working class organizations that are fully independent and led from below don't have. Because if you come from the exploited and the oppressed, it is hard to organize yourself and sustain. So I think this is something for us also to think through which sectors of the left and how it comes that today they can speak with a voice that does not represent the popular support they claim to have.
John, maybe you can burrow down to the U.S. left, or take it however you want it. I'm just particularly interested in the U.S. left's maladies. But go ahead, you take it.
Well, I mean, to be honest, the central malady of the U.S. left is the lack of experience in governance. I mean, that I think is what distinguishes our left from lefts in other countries. I mean, sure, there are some lefts in other countries that are as marginalized as we are here, but we don't really have the experience of making difficult decisions, engaging with other countries and diplomacy, et cetera. So we tend to be rather abstract in our and almost purist in our positions here in the United States because we don't deal with the challenges of power. Power in a real sense. But I did want to, I really appreciated what Ilya said about democracy and the failure of the left to put democracy at the center of our programs, because it reveals that we actually, on the left as well, bought the argument, the Fukuyama argument, the argument of the neoliberals, that markets and democracies go together. And so we say, oh, well, then democracy is by definition bourgeois. I was like, no, why are you accepting that argument that we don't believe in? They believe in it, we don't believe in it. So that's deeply frustrating. I agree completely with what Blanca says about how engagement overseas transforms perspective. So obviously, it's absolutely necessary for the left to have experience of what the left in Russia is saying, what the left in Ukraine is saying, to understand. Now, of course, the Code Pink will come back and say, well, actually, we do have our contacts in Ukraine. They have like 2 people that they've identified that speak their mind, speak the Code Pink position. But that's not real kind of engagement with a popular movement or with a real left. And similarly, I would say that, you look in Latin America, there's lots of solidarity work among countries in Latin America. They know what the left is doing in each other's countries. And there's some, and I'm engaged in this on a daily basis, forging solidaristic links with left in Asia and Africa. It doesn't actually mean that they've taken a good position on Ukraine. In fact, their positions in general in Ukraine are lousy. So just because they have pretty good networks of solidarity and international cooperation doesn't necessarily lead to kind of principled engagement on these issues, such as the hegemonic or imperialist impulses of a country like Russia or China. And I think, at least from the Latin American perspective, it's because it's still the heavy presence of the United States. The United States and its imperialist policies have had such an impact on Latin America that it's very difficult to get out from under that shadow. If there's anything good about the transformation of the world order and the relative decline of U.S. power, it means that the U.S. will, as a historic force and as a current force, it won't exert that same kind of overwhelming influence on other countries so that they can thus perceive and understand the imperialisms of other countries like Russia, China, etc.
Thanks, John. Ilya, maybe really on the Russia, Ukraine, and Ukraine's struggle for self-determination and why the left should support it.
Firstly, I want to support everything what Blanca and John just said, and I think it's very important to stress this lack of internationalism, not only among some sections of the US left, but also Western European left, and also this very narrow nationalist, let's say, perspective, which partly like historically understandable. So, for example, if you discuss with the German left, who oppose the arms to Ukraine, who oppose any support for Ukrainian self-determination, you can see the very kind of exact and very justified concern, unlike the concern of American left. And for them, this is concern of remilitarization of Germany and, some sort of revision of the pacifist ground of the German foreign policy after the Second World War, and that is very important, and it's very important not just for Germany but for Europe, like in general. And I can understand these concerns, but the challenge to the current, let's say, architecture of Europe or of the peace in Europe is very serious. and you need to revise and rethink the grounds of your own political beliefs. And we are living in such a moment when we should revise this grounds. I totally understand that it's very painful. I totally understand that you have all these traditions of the left from the past behind it. For example, in Turkey, I spent a whole year in Turkey, and I talk a lot with the Turkish left. For them to say anything positive like about NATO, or kind of something that should be look like as the critical support of NATO is impossible, because it's very the NATO is very much linked to the whole decades of the history of the repressions against the left, against the liberation movements in this country. So in this sense, is not a easy decision, to say let's support the self-determination of Ukraine, taking into account all these historical traditions, of these kind of experiences of the past. But I think that this revision of the, let's say, framework of the left could be only international thing. It could be done only with the equal dialogue between the left from different countries, from different parts of the globe, and of the different perspectives. And that's why I think that the discussions like this are so useful and so important.
Thank you, Ilya. Any closing comments? We'll just go in reverse order that we started with. So Blanca, any closing comments, and then John and Ilya will wrap us up, and I'll say a few concluding words. Go ahead, Blanca. Any concluding thoughts?
Oh, I wanted just to tackle the question you combined, which what is the alternative, which I know I did not speak about that. And, I think the alternative is not only to connect internationally, but to connect independent working class movements of solidarity internationally. And it is not easy to start here in the United States, like we are starting with the USN, the Ukraine Solidarity Network, a campaign that supports the right of Ukrainians for self-determination, while at the same time we remain independent of our own government, and we seek to establish links with equivalent organizations, social movements in Ukraine and in Russia that have also been fighting for social democratic economic rights. But to do so allows us to not have to go through our own imperialist governments to express solidarity. It allows us to have an independent expression of solidarity, which is not just independent formally, but also in nature. It allows us to say, we support the right of Ukrainians to get arms and weapons or whatever they need to win the war, while at the same time having a very critical stance in the United States on the Biden administration, on the way it's proposing to send arms, on the race to arming NATO and expanding NATO, which we oppose here in the United States, and also connecting with other movements of solidarity, which we know is not easy. One of the big discussions we have in the Ukraine Solidarity Network is how do we relate to the movement of liberation of Palestine? And can we articulate, and it's not an easy discussion, but can we articulate a discussion where the US working class and popular and youth left is discussing with the Ukrainian one, with the Palestinian one, with the Russian one, and see how together we think through the contradictions and obstacles of solidarity and how we work out an internationalist movement of solidarity. I think this is the real alternative. It is not an easy path, but it's the only path not to get trapped into the scenes and of our own government, because for the Ukrainian left, for example, they also need to have a space to criticize the neoliberal policies of Zelensky and the deal Zelensky is making with the European Union and the IMF to already selling its country and attacking the rights of workers in the middle of the war, right? And so that's something we need to create a space for us to connect from below with a principle of working class solidarity, class independence, and internationalism. And I think it is possible because we're doing it. We just need to do it more.
Thanks, Blanca. John, you're up.
Yeah, okay. I thumbs up to that. I guess I would. The only comment I would make as a concluding comment is, At a certain level, it looks like Putin has come out of this 2 years on from the invasion doing pretty well. The economy's doing okay. I mean, it's under a lot of sanctions, but there's some growth here. Obviously, the oil and natural gas still being sold to lower prices, perhaps, but still being sold, providing a sufficient amount of money for the Russian military, as a huge portion of the Russian budget, of course, going to the military. It's cementing ties with China, with North Korea. But I would say, in fact, when we look back at 2022 from, say, 10 or 15 years on, I think we'll see this as really the moment at which Putin overreached, not only overreached in terms of his ability to determine outcomes on the ground in Ukraine, and perhaps not only eventually his own hold on power inside Russia, but really the geopolitical devolvement, if you will, devolution of Russian power, that he had a chance to really cement ties with the far right in Europe, and actually perhaps swing the European Union in a different direction, only to find 2 years later that, yeah, okay, he's still best buds with Viktor Orban, but someone like Giorgia Meloni, the prime minister in Italy, swinging completely in a different direction in support of NATO and support of Ukraine. I mean, that's really a tremendous shift in Europe, and losing, even despite kind of good relations formally with China, the fact that Russia has proven itself incapable of invading and controlling a smaller and weaker country on its borders, this is seen by China as an embarrassment, that Russia is really kind of not a reliable ally, a country that's unpredictable and incapable of determining outcomes on the ground, and therefore not a reliable ally. And that actually undermines Russia's position within BRICS more generally. This what was presented as the real counter-hegemonic bloc to Anglo-Saxons or the United States or the collective West or whatever. But Russia has really kind of pushed a number of its allies into thinking, we're having second thoughts on our relationship with Russia. Okay, formally, yeah, we're not gonna go against it in the UN, but we really have to rethink this relationship, because this is kind of a crazy country under Putin's governance. And so I see this as yes, we can talk about Russia's incremental victories on the ground in Ukraine. We can talk about its survival of sanctions domestically in Russia itself. But I think that the larger project of Putinism, globally speaking, has really been set back considerably as a result of what's happened over the last 2 years.
Ilya, you get the last word.
Yeah, it's very optimistic conclusion of John, because I think that unfortunately the situation is not so bad for Putin, because okay, he even already in 2014. Showed for the Europeans, for all the neighboring countries, for all the countries in the post-Soviet space, that Russia is unstable, that Russia is aggressive, is not predictable. It's even playing with the nuclear bomb danger and so on. And nothing really happened, because that's the true value of sovereignty. So if you are sitting on the nuclear bomb, if you are sitting on the natural sources, finally everyone will speak with you, will make a deal with you, and that's unfortunately what could happen in Ukraine to the end of this year. Some sort of a deal which Putin will take definitely as a signal to continue, to prepare a bit, and then to continue the further expansion in the post-Soviet, let's say, space, or maybe in the Eastern Europe, like in general. Because if you are following the Russian propaganda, they are openly talking about the new offensive. They are talking about taking over Kiev, in coming months. They're talking about some possible moves in the Baltics, some moves in Transnistria and Moldova, and so on. So you already have a kind of a country with the vision of the world, where the true sovereign could not be stopped. It could not be restrained by any rules, any kind of pragmatic, pragmatic vision. So in this way, I think it is very important now to stay with Ukraine, to support Ukraine, to explain that the sort of deal with Putin, it will be not a peace solution, like at all. It will be, invitation for the further imperialist expansion of Russia in the region, and also it will be a signal for other countries, for other in other parts of the world, that such things are possible. If you see the events during the last 2 years, like in chain, if you see what happened in Ukraine, if you see what happened in Palestine, if you see what happened in Karabakh, in between Armenia and Azerbaijan, where basically the ethnic cleaning of Armenian, of more than 100,000 Armenians happened. So all of it show that some let's say, window of opportunities for such genocidal or aggressive politics, there became more, let's say, more wide, more open. And that's we have to understand for sure that is the main, danger for the globe, for the people globally, and that's why I think the issue of Ukrainian solidarity is so important and has so, let's say, true internationalist value.
Thank you so much to all the speakers, to Ilya, to John, to Blanca. And I think this was a brilliant discussion, and it underscores what we're trying to do in the Ukraine Solidarity Network, which is to oppose all occupations, that the occupation of Ukraine is a crime. And so is the occupation of Palestine is a crime. And as an international left, we have to stand united in a common struggle across borders in defense of oppressed nations for self-determination, and for uniting people globally in a struggle for democracy, and for much further than that, a real transformation of our society so that it puts people first instead of profit and empire. So just want to thank all the speakers and to the audience, and I encourage people to check out the Ukraine Solidarity Network, our other events and our projects, and we'll have many further ones coming up. And just to underscore the significance of what Ilya said, we all have to stand with Ukraine in its fight for its freedom. Thank you all. Good evening.